our virtual lectures in general surgery. Before we start the session, I would like to thank all the chairpersons and the speakers for coming and gracing the occasion in a very short duration. And I'll ask Mumbai Surgical Society President Dr. Niranjan Agarwal to start the session, and then we'll move ahead. Over to Dr. Niranjan Agarwal.
Thank you, Rajesh. So another warm good evening on another Friday. We will continue, but there will be some hitches this month because the ASI has prevented all the faculties to being part in any of the webinar if they are participating in the elections. So there may be some hitches somewhere. The president is here. ASI president is logged in. I'm not complaining, but this is a serious concern that we will not be able to involve many faculty because most of them are involved in the elections. So please bear with us. And today we have some senior members talking, very experienced members talking, and a very experienced member himself chairing the session also, you know. So I wish all the delegates a very warm learning evening to all of them. And over to you, Rajesh. You can introduce the chairpersons. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Niranjan. So we have two eminent chairpersons today. First is Dr. Rajan Relekar. Dr. Rajan Relekar is an honorary associate professor of surgery at RG Medical College and CSM Hospital, Thane. He is a consulting general and laparoscopic surgeon. Our second chairperson is Dr. Anirudh Patil. He is a leading laparoscopic surgeon at Bombay Hospital, and his special interest is in laparoscopic thyroid surgery. So over to you, Dr. Relekar and Dr. Anirudh Patil, to introduce our speakers and start the session.
Good evening all. At the outset, I thank Mumbai Surgical Society for giving me this opportunity to chair today's session. I must compliment Dr. Agarwal and Dr. Rajesh Yadav for conducting this virtual lecture series in general surgery on various topics which are useful for postgraduate as well as we practicing surgeons. Today, our first speaker is Dr. J.B. Agarwal, senior consultant, and he is a senior GI, laparoscopic and bariatric surgeon. He is one of the pioneers in establishing laparoscopic surgery in India. He is founder, secretary of prestigious IIGS. For us, he is a teacher of teachers. With this brief introduction, I request sir to start his lecture on stomas.
Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of Mumbai Surgical Society for asking me to deliver this lecture. I would like to thank President Niranjan Agarwal and Rajesh Yadav, Secretary, for choosing me to deliver a lecture on a little difficult topic, unusual topic on stoma. I would like to also thank our chairpersons, Dr. Rajan Relekar and Patil Anirudh, who are our colleagues, and my co-speaker Rajiv, who has been known to me for many, many years. So with these few words, I would like to start my presentation. Friends, one second, just, okay. Can you see my slides? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Shall I go ahead?
Sir, make it full screen. It's not full screen. Please make it full screen.
Now?
Yes, perfect. Now it's perfect.
Okay. I have no disclosures to make, but I would like to say that few of the slides I have taken from Dr. Buch, who has lent me some slides, and I would like to thank him for this contribution. Friends, intestinal stoma are surgical exteriorization of either the small or large bowel. Through anterior abdominal wall, intestinal stomas or stoma on the artificial bowel opening created onto the skin to evacuate bowel contents. This is another definition. And friends, stoma is an essential part of GI surgery. There are other stomas like tracheostomy and others, but I'm not going to deal because I'm going to restrict only to GI tract stomas. The prevalence rate of GI tract stoma is about 0.2%, and roughly in India, we don't have exact figure, but about 1 lakh stomas are created every year. The indications for creating stoma could be a cancer of bowel, ischemic bowel, inflammatory bowel diseases, anal incontinence, chronic obstipation, and complicated diverticulitis with perforation and things like that. The stoma site is a very, very important part of creating a stoma. Selection of a stoma site should be planned well in advance. It will depend on patient's lifestyle, what sort of a lifestyle he lives, what sort of an active lifestyle, whether he participates in sports, whether he participates in other activities, occupation of the patient, clothing preferences of the patient, bowel functions of the patient, and if he has some disabilities, that also should be taken into consideration. It should be done in collaboration with the stoma nurse because they are the ones who are going to take care of him post-operatively throughout his life. Lack of preoperative marking of the potential stoma site is a major significant risk factor for problematic stoma, which could be really troublesome for the patient for the rest of his life. You should observe the patient's sitting posture, standing, bending, and then probably mark the stoma into the ward, not on the operation table at the last minute. These are the stomas which are preferably marked. Ileostomy preferably on the right side through the rectus, and colostomy on the left side. That is the ideal site for the stoma. The types of stoma could be either ileal or colonic. It could be emergency or elective. It could be temporary or a permanent. It could be through the rectus muscle, trans rectus muscle, or a lateral stoma in certain circumstances where you cannot create a stoma through the rectus muscle. It could be end stoma, it could be loop stoma, which is in continuity, or it could be a double barrel stoma with 2 loops separate. Malposition of stoma is rather a frequent problem and demonstrates the haste on the part of the surgeon or a lack of collaboration with the stoma therapist. The patient can arrive in the operation room without the drawing that indicates the most appropriate site for the stoma, and this will lead to malposition of the stoma, which is not the right thing to do. Delegating stoma creation to a under-supervised junior surgical resident at the end of the procedure who has minimal experience on creating a stoma is never appropriate. This delegation of responsibility to junior resident implies the surgeon is only concerned about saving the patient's life, but not the quality of patient's life, because the patient has to live with the stoma for the rest of his life. So please take care and mark your stomas properly in the ward, in various postures, in conjunction with the stoma nurse. That is the proper way of marking the stoma. Malposition of a stoma also could occur if you are having it near the bony projection, because then the application of the appliances make it very difficult. On the scar, again, it will irritate the scar. In the umbilicus is again not accepted. In a laparotomy incision also is not acceptable to create a stoma, or at the bottom of the adipose fold also is not the proper site because it will prevent the application of the appliances to the stoma. Here are few examples of improper stoma, which makes it difficult to manage. In the first side, on the left-hand side, you can see an end colostomy in the incision itself, making it impossible to fix a bag. And the patient has to irrigate his stoma twice a day to manage because he cannot fix a belt on it and the stoma bag. On the right-hand side, you can see a retracted ileostomy in the incision. It has been created in the incision near the costal arch in a paraplegic patient, which is again not the ideal site for creating the stoma. This is another stoma which is created near the rib cage, just under the costal margin, which is not again a right side to create a stoma because this will be very difficult to manage with the belt. So please do not create stomas onto the bony prominences. The steps of surgery of creating stoma, you all know it, but just to reiterate again for the juniors who are attending this lecture, you have to cut a disc, not make a cruciate incision, but you have to cut a disc of skin and subcutaneous tissue, which should be roughly about 2.5 centimeters. It could be smaller or bigger, depending on the size of the patient. Then you go to the anterior rectus sheet and cut the rectus sheet in a disc manner. Then you open the rectus in the direction of the muscle, not across the muscle. Otherwise, you will divide the muscles, and that will be, again, helping in creating a parastomal hernia. Then you open the posterior rectus sheet and again cut it properly. And then, rather than pulling the bowel through the stoma into the exterior, it is better to push, because pulling can tear the things, can devascularize the area. So be careful while delivering the bowel through the stoma. Then you take care of how much bowel should be brought out, exteriorized. In a colon, it is said that 2 centimeters above the skin should be ideal portion of the colon. And in ileum, it should be about 5 centimeters above the skin level for creating a proper stoma. Matured colon should protrude out of the skin for about 0.5 to 1 centimeter above the skin level. That is the ideal stoma. And matured ileum should protrude out for about 2 to 2.5 centimeters. It should be like a nipple above the skin level. Then it is the ideal stoma, which can help in applying the bag, stoma bag, very properly and will prevent complications. Ileostomy should be always everted. And for eversion, there is a stitch which is known as triplicate suture. And this stitch is nothing but it is a stitch which takes skin bite first, then a seromuscular bite 5 centimeters proximal to the end of the bowel, and then a full thickness bite onto the cut edge of the bowel, which creates a nipple and causes inversion of the stoma. That is the ideal stitch to be taken for creating a stoma. For stoma care, there are various things to be taken into consideration. We are fortunate in Bombay that we have a Ostomy Association of India, and they really help in helping the patient with the stoma with appliances. They send even a nurse to the residents of the patient to help them out and to teach them how to take care of the stoma. There is a helpline number of Ostomy Association also, which you can use and give it to the patient. There are various books also available by the producers of the stoma appliances, which can be very helpful, and it is in multiple languages, in probably all the languages which are in India. So the patient can find it very convenient to help himself with the stoma. There are various types of appliances available depending on the type of stoma, where the stoma is, and the preference. So you can easily look into the different types and take help of a stoma nurse to allow you to fit proper appliance so that you don't have any problem of leakage and things like this. There are various gauges which are available to see the size of the stoma so that you can cut the hole into the appliance and make a proper hole, because if you create a bigger hole, then the stools will be coming in contact with the skin and cause excoriation and various other complications. So you have to cut the ring of the appliance, the sticking part of it, in a proper direction and proper size. Various types of paste, Karaya gum and various paste which are available, various powders are available, various adhesive discs are available to help you in applying the appliances properly so as to prevent leakage. And now most of the appliances can be managed in the same thing for about a week or so. You don't have to change I remember during my resident days, we used to use the football bladder as an appliance, and there were nothing available in 1965, 66, like what we have today. So now we have a lot of varieties of appliances which can be applied according to the suitable of the patient. Now, revision of stoma, I went to the literature and found out that 30% of the stomas need re-intervention because sometimes they are not proper, sometimes there's something wrong, either they are getting retracted, they are getting protruded, the things like this. And 70% will get complication in the long run. And the most common complication in the long run is the parastomal hernia, of which I will talk a little later on. Closure of stoma, when you are creating a temporary stoma, closure of stoma should be done only after the stoma is matured properly, at least minimum 8 weeks of temporary stoma. Then only you should think of closure, not earlier, even if the patient demands so. And 10% of stoma closure carries the risk of complications. So don't leave the stoma closure to most junior person because it can cause complication if not closed properly. There could be another leak and you are not going to create another stoma for closure of the stoma. So we have to be very, very careful when you do closure of the stoma of a temporary nature. This is one of the diagram to show you how you irrigate and manage a stoma where you cannot fix the bag or patient does not have comfort in putting a bag and he wants to manage his stoma without putting a bag. You have to every day morning irrigate with this irrigation device and the cone which is there. You can see this cone nicely which fits into the stoma. You put fluid and allow it to drain out and like this, and then after that irrigation, you just cover it with a gauze piece. That is the way a stoma can be managed without putting appliances. Here you can see the patient just putting a gauze piece and a tape to manage his stoma after irrigation. What are the complications of stoma? There could be early complications or there could be late complications. The early complications are ischemia, necrosis, fluid and electrolyte imbalance if the patient is having a lot of diarrhea through the stoma, or if the stoma is in the proximal part of the small bowel, then they can lose a lot of fluid and electrolytes and cause imbalance. Mucocutaneous junction, if it is not properly healed, then there could be separation due to infection or various technical reasons, and it can cause problem. There could be retraction of the stoma, there could be stenosis early, that is early complication. And in late complication, the most common, as I told you, is parastomal hernia, which is a common in almost 70% of stomas in the long run. Prolapse of the stoma, varicose vein formation around the stoma, and there is a special complication in the stoma, which is known as parastomal pyoderma gangrenosum. This is a separate entity by itself, and I'm not going to elaborate much on PPG because this is a separate topic by itself, and there could be late stenosis of the stoma. Our aim should be to prevent all these complications by proper marking of the stoma, proper formation of the stoma, proper care of the stoma. Now I'll just show you a few pictures of the complicated stomas. Here, the stoma was created in the wound, and you can see how badly it is infected. So this is not the ideal site and ideal way of the stoma. This is the case of a stoma necrosis. The necrosis of the stoma could be of two types. One is above the facial layer and or deeper to the fascia. If it is deeper in the abdominal, then it could perforate and cause fecal peritonitis if you are late in treating the stomal necrosis. Or if it is in the facial level, then it will cause the infection of the skin level and the subcutaneous level and may not cause a fecal peritonitis. So you have to treat stoma necrosis accordingly due to the depth of the stoma, what is the, whether it is 2 centimeter, 3 centimeter, 5 centimeter, accordingly you have to take corrective measures. This is the retracted stoma, which again makes it very difficult to apply appliances. So always take care, but you might have to revise such a stoma and create a proper stoma with the nipple. This is the excoriation because of improper fixation of the device, and they cause severe excoriation, and this causes severe pain, itching, and irritation. and the patient is miserable. So apply proper paste, apply proper powder, and then apply proper fitting devices which does not cause any leakage outside. Cut the disc properly just to fit into the stoma. That should be the ideal thing. This is very badly managed stoma where you can see the whole skin around it. There has been a lot of leaking of the fecal matter around, and that will cause this sort of a picture. So one has to take care and teach them how to apply the stoma devices properly, the bags. This is the case of prolapse of stoma. This can be also probably partially prevented if you create a too big a this thing opening, or if there is too much of chronic coughing and this thing, then this sort of a stoma prolapse can occur. This is a parastomal hernia, classical parastomal hernia, which in a long run, it is said that almost after 10 years of stomach creation, 70% of patients will have a parastomal hernia. So one has to be very careful about, and I will talk about the prevention of the parastomal hernia in a little later. There could be fistulas formation around the stoma. The kinds of fistula could be transstomal, which is frequent in ileostomy stoma, or peristomal, or a colocutaneous fistula, which is also there. The common causes for formation of fistulas is either traumatic during surgery, or suture point where the stitch is not taken properly and it forms a fistula, or in a Crohn's disease, there could be a fistulous formation around the stoma. This is one of the cases where there has been a fistula around, and after putting a artery fossum inside, you can see the stitch there here, which after removal of the stitch, this fistula healed. So one has to be careful and treat the fistula properly after finding out what is the cause of the fistula. Now, I will talk something about parastomal hernias. Now, the risk of parastomal hernia, I have written down here. It could be patient-related. Parastomal hernias are more common in female, age more than 60 years, BMI more than 30 years, or having comorbidities. Underlying disease like smokers will have more chance of parastomal hernia. Inflammatory bowel disease, it is more common in Crohn's disease as compared to ulcerative colitis. Or if the patient is on immunomodulator treatment, then again the chances of parastomal hernia is more. Both transplant also, because they are on immunomodulator, so the chance of parastomal hernias are more. The type of stoma, what you have created, colostomy carries always a higher risk of parastomal hernia as compared to loop ileostomy. So if you are given a choice, I think it should be loop ileostomy because that will have a lower risk of parastomal hernia. Surgical technique, site outside the rectus sheath or rectus muscle will always have a higher chance of So as far as possible, create the stoma into the rectus, to the rectus muscle, to the rectus sheath, anterior and posterior, and not the lateral stoma. Lateral stoma will always have higher chance of parastomal hernia. Patient with an increased abdominal pressure like a chronic COPD, chronic constipation with ascites always will have a higher chances of parastomal hernia formations. If the patient is having collagen deficiency and if there is no proper formation of fibroblast, then again they will have a higher chance of parastomal hernia, and it is a genetic disorder which you have nothing much to do. Prevention of parastomal hernia, how can you prevent? The aperture size when you make a stoma should be just 2 to 3 millimeters rim around the stoma. Stoma is larvae due to edema in emergency. In emergency, the bowel is edematous, and when you create a stoma, after the bowel shrinks, there will be enough space around the bowel and the stoma, which the defect in the wall of the abdomen. So there are very high chances. So in emergency, you have to take that into consideration and create as small a possible opening in the abdomen as possible. Use of flexible appliances make it easier for the stoma prevention and hernia and complications of stoma. Skin sealants may optimize appliances of adherent. Nowadays, you don't also, in addition to the skin sealants, you have various discs which you can apply around the stoma to make it level and then put the appliances. So a lot of devices are now being manufactured by the company. Stoma belts are also of various sizes and various types, which holds the bag into position and helps you in, and there are now binders also in addition, which will help you in maintaining the position of the bag, colostomy bag as we call it. The newer topic in stoma is to use prophylactic mesh. While you are creating a stoma, there are now various articles which say that you should use a mesh while creating a stoma to prevent the peristomal hernia formation. I'll talk to you about this little later. Now, if you have a peristomal hernia, what are the repair strategies? The repair strategies either are the conservative management or open surgical repair with or without a mesh, or a laparoscopic repair, which is the most preferred method of repair of a peristomal hernia. And nowadays, it could be conventional repair or it could be even a robotic technique, because now robots are available in various centers and people are opting out for more and more robotic surgery. This is one of the ways of managing a small peristomal hernia with a belt, which is a special belt. Asymptomatic patient with minor symptoms can be managed with this method. Patient is given a special belt or a corset-like belt, which prevents the bulging and prevents the progress of a peristomal hernia. So this is the most simple way of managing a small peristomal hernia. Laparoscopic repair, there could be various techniques of repairing the peristomal hernia. If you can take down the stoma and close it permanently, that is the best way of preventing a peristomal hernia or treating a peristomal hernia. Primary repair without the mesh is not acceptable at all, because it has been proved that you will have almost 100% recurrence of the hernia repair. Mesh repair, there are very common technique is the sugar bakers. Now there are various modifications in the sugar baker. You can use the mesh with the keyhole or with a cruciate or with a sandwich technique where you use two meshes, or nowadays a funnel shaped 3D mesh is available, which can be used when you are creating a stoma to prevent a peristomal hernia formation or even a repair the peristomal hernia. Modified sugar baker is the commonest technique nowadays being used for repairing the peristomal hernia. It could be combined with ETAP or anterior component separation or posterior component separation, what we know as TAR. Resite with laparotomy. If you have to resite the stoma along with the laparotomy, then you have to be very careful, because you are creating three potential risks for the hernia formation. One is the previous stoma site, second is the midline incision, and third, you are creating a new stoma. So there are three potential sites for stoma creation, and the resiting could be on the same side or it could be contralateral side. So according to the situation, you have to choose how to repair this sort of a peristomal hernias. Resite without laparotomy also can be done in some selected cases. There are some papers which say that you can. These are the various ways the mesh can be put in creating a peristomal hernia repair. It could be onlay, it could be bridging, it could be sublay, or it could be intraperitoneal. But the best method is to put a retrorectal mesh. This is the best site for putting a mesh. And let me tell you one more point. When you put a mesh into this retrorectal space, it is said that the retrorectal space has got good vascularity. So because of the good vascularity, the chances of infection are much less. So when you're putting a mesh in the stoma, the chances, if you can put the mesh in the retrorectal space, this is the best site for preventing infection and causing less complication in repair of the peristomal hernia. Few lines about the sandwich technique of putting a mesh. There are two meshes which are used in this technique. One is a keyhole fashion and the other is overlapping the first keyhole mesh in a form of a sugar baker configuration. After this sandwich technique, in the Essence article of 212, he has said that his recurrence rate was only 2.1%, which is a very good recurrence, low recurrence rate. Modified Sugarbaker technique. It is the reef stoma, as I was telling you, in the retrorectus space, where the bowel loop is tunneled so that the bulge goes away from the this thing, and the mesh is extraperitoneal, retromuscular, and a concomitant midline hernia also can be tackled simultaneously. There's a beautiful article by Moisam from from Belgium, who is pioneer in treating such hernias, and he has written a very elaborate article on this. There is another method called PPHR. Pauli is another expert in treating peristomal hernia, Eric Pauli, and he has devised a technique called as PPHR, avoids ostomy relocation, because relocation, as I told you earlier, carries 3 sites for potential hernia. Posterior component separation, then you lateralize the proximal bowel. That is the method by which you can do that. And it is the modified Sugarbaker method in which you put the mesh, and the mesh is retromuscular plane and in a sublay fashion to cover the proximal bowel. You can look into the literature. Here is a diagrammatic representation of the thing where you close the posterior rectus sheet and lateralize the bowel. After closing, the bowel will look like this, but there is only when you put the mesh, there is angulation, the bowel can erode the bowel. The mesh can erode the bowel here. So you have to be careful that you are not causing a severe kinking of the bowel to prevent the, so to overcome that, there is another method called as stapled mesh stoma reinforcement technique or SMART technique. I'll show you the diagrammatic representation and show you the details, just small detail about the SMART technique described by Williams in 2011 for prophylaxis of the peristomal hernia formation. Easier way to place the mesh. It avoids the stretching of the rectus muscle, used a special design stapler, which they devised for creating this, or the regular standard circular stapler, which we use for EEA, for bowel-to-bowel anastomosis also can be used. And here the mesh gets fixed onto the tissues by a staple technique, so it does not migrate, it does not cause any space between the mesh and to the bowel, so the chances of recurrence or chances of formation of stoma are very, very less, and it is one of the ways of preventing or prophylactic use of the mesh for peristomal hernia prevention. This is the diagrammatic representation where you can see that the mesh is stapled all around and it gets fixed onto the tissue very nicely. So, and then you deliver the bowel through the stapled disc which is created. So the mesh remains stable. There is very little gap between the mesh and the bowel. So the stoma can be created and the chances of peristomal hernia are reduced. There is another technique called by devised by Nowinski. Nowinski is an AWR surgeon, abdominal wall reconstruction surgeon, and he's the one who has invented TAR, transverse abdominis release. And here he talks it as STORRM, STORM technique, stapled transabdominal ostomy, reinforcement, retromuscular mesh. The mesh is reinforced during TAR and prevents angulation. This is what I was talking to you. If you cause too much of angulation, then the mesh can erode into the bowel and cause fistula formation. So this is the technique where you prevent the fistula formation and angulation of the bowel. Now, few words about resiting of the stoma. Resiting, this is the old stoma where there was a hernia. Then you make a new stoma here and resite the stoma. I'll show you diagrammatically how you create this resiting. See, the patient had a stoma here, a hernia here, then he had a midline hernia. So the new stoma is created on the opposite side. You close this side and you put a big mesh, triangular mesh. You can see this big mesh, 30 by 30, which is put, which will cover this, which will cover midline, and which will cover the potential site of the, cover the potential site of the new stoma also. So this is the resiting of stoma diagrammatically. And another transfer diagram, this is the mesh which is put all across which will cover all the 3 sites. And this is the previous stoma site, this is the new stoma site. So midline hernia cannot occur. Hernia cannot occur through the previous stoma, and hernia cannot occur through the resited stoma. So this is another way of preventing this thing. I was talking to you about 3D funneled mesh. This is another mesh which is available nowadays. It is sort of a funnel. See, there is a horizontal and there is a funnel way through which you take the bowel. So the funnel forms a layer around the bowel to prevent the hernia formation. You can create this while forming the stoma initially during the first phase for prevention, or you can use it as a secondary thing for treating also parastomal hernia. So this is a novel technique, and they treated 80 patients, Kohler et al., 80 patients with 3D mesh, and in an IPOM fashion. You can see this is IPOM fashion, and there was hardly any stoma herniation. These are the experiences with prophylactic meshes. These are the 3 articles which I found. One is using 42 patients, 14 patients, and 27 patients. Here, they reported that there was no infection in 12 months. And without the mesh, there were 8 hernia formation. And with the mesh, there was 0 hernia formation in this series. And here also, 1 out of 43 only required the removal of the mesh because of infection, and none developed the hernia. So I think gradually we are moving from creating a stoma without the mesh to creating a stoma with the mesh to prevent the parastomal hernia formation during the initial first operative time only. Now, you can use even synthetic mesh also if you're worried about formation or infection or removal of the mesh, which gets dissolved gradually in some period. So they have reported that 75 out of 93 patients had sublay, lightweight, partially absorbable mesh, and mean follow-up was 15 months. Hernia rate with the mesh was only 13%, but hernia rate without the mesh in a long run was 67%. So, and this skin and soft tissue infection rate was 27%. So one has to be careful when to push the mesh and use it judiciously. If you feel the patient is very obese, having BMI very high, and he has a very high chance of getting a parastomal hernia, I think it is very, very necessary to use a mesh to prevent the parastomal hernia creation. At the end, friends, I would like to conclude my talk by making few statements with my experience, what I've learned. Stoma can be created by a surgeon in less than 30 minutes, but the patient has to live with it for his lifetime. So take this into consideration. Construction of stoma should not be left to the junior most part of the team. It should be always supervised. It should be supervised by a senior person who will guide the junior to create a proper stoma. It should be constructed properly at the previously agreed upon appropriate site through rectus muscle and should be without any complication. That should be the aim. Lots of psychological issues are also there. So the psychological issues can be prevented by pre-op, post-op counseling by the surgeons and the counseling team. If possible, a meeting would be of new ostomate should be arranged with a fully rehabilitated as gender matched colleague who has got a ostomate or who has got a ostomy. When they meet each other, they can exchange their ideas. All the fear of a stoma creation can be taken away and the patient can be counseled properly. That is the ideal way. And as I told you earlier, Ostomy Association of India is available in most of the metropolitan cities. Take help of them. They will help your patient to a great extent. Thank you, friends, for patient listening. If there are anything, any questions, I'm most willing to answer them.
Thank you, sir, for very informative lecture. And you gave us a lot of practical tips on creation of the stoma and prevention of common complications. You also mentioned almost 1/3 of the stomas may require re-intervention if not done properly.
Yes.
And almost 2/3 may develop the complication in long run, especially the parastomal hernia. And you have elaborated on the management of parastomal hernia by mentioning various techniques, conventional sugar breaker, Polly's repair, as well as newer staple technique and the construction of the new stoma. He also mentioned the prophylactic use of mesh. I don't know how far we are using in practice, but that appears to be a very new technique in prevention of the parastomal hernia. Thank you, sir. There are some questions lined up for you in the chat box. Can I ask them now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
You go ahead and ask them.
I will stop sharing this thing. Screen share, I will stop.
Dr. Rajan, ask the questions right away.
Yes, sir. There is a question from Dr. Hemant Mehta. He asks, please elaborate on the sac orientation of hernia in stoma.
Sorry?
When you are managing parastomal hernia. Orientation of the sac vis-a-vis the loop, the stoma.
No, I didn't understand your question well. Please repeat again.
He is asking, please elaborate on the sac orientation of hernia in stomas.
Sac orientation.
Even I didn't get the question actually. Please
I
elaborate on the sac
asking how to
orientation
manage the
of hernia
sac
and stoma.
when there is a parastomal hernia, when you are doing surgery for that.
See, when you're doing the parastomal hernia surgery, the sac, if it is large enough, I would say that you excise the lining of the sac. And when you are closing, you close the sac, the defect by a shoelace technique, by taking 2-0, or number 2 Prolene suture through the cutaneous and, take a suture across like we have IPOM plus and then close the defect. And while closing the defect, take a bite of the roof of the sac so that the dead space is reduced. So one is to excise the sac if possible. Second, you can cauterize the sac with the bipolar cautery so that the secretions are much less. And third is to take a bite onto the roof of the sac when you are closing the sac by interrupted suture or by continuous suture in a shoelace fashion.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I hope he is satisfied with the answer. And there is one more question, sir. How to manage the necrosis of the stoma?
Necrosis?
Yes, sir.
See, necrosis occurs probably due to various reasons. One, probably you have devitalized the bowel too much. That should be prevented because we are in a fashion of, when the terminal end is there, we cut all the adipose tissue, epididymis, epiploicae, and cauterize there. I think you should just apply a staple across the large bowel to prevent. And second, nowadays we have ICG technique. Most of the cameras are now can give you ICG. So you make use of the ICG technique and see that the vascularity is good. And if you are doubtful, cut that avascular or little ischemic bowel then and there only. So, and then third is when you have created an opening in the abdominal wall, put 2 fingers inside and see that it is properly this thing. It is not too tight. Sometimes it is the rectus sheath which is tight and which constricts the blood supply. So these are the techniques. And see on the table that the stoma is bleeding nicely. If you have any doubt, cut the excess portion of the bowel and have a good vascular bowel. And the fourth is there should not be any tension onto the stoma formation. It should be well mobilized. And for colon, we say always it is a good point to mobilize the splenic flexure because that will take the tension away. Sometimes people have a shortcut and don't mobilize the splenic flexure in resection. So that should be a point which is always very, very helpful in preventing the necrosis of the stoma.
Yes, sir.
Rajan, Dr. Relekar, you can ask the person who had asked the question whether if he's unsatisfied, then you can unmute him.
Yes,
sir. You can unmute the person who had asked
Actually, the question was, Niranjan, the question is, how do you manage when there is necrosis of stoma?
No, not this one. The sac question.
The first one.
Orientation. Orientation.
By Dr. Mehta.
Anyways, otherwise we'll take it at the end. We'll move on with Dr. Rajiv Joshi's talk.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
So our next speaker would be Dr. Rajiv Joshi. He is Emeritus Professor of Surgery, TN Medical College and Nair Hospital. And he is a consultant hepatopancreatobiliary and GI surgeon at Wockhardt and Saifi Hospitals. Over to you, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, Rajiv.
Yes, Rajiv.
Yeah. Thank you. At the outset, let me thank the Mumbai Surgical Society and my good friends Rajesh Yadav, Niranjan Agarwal for this opportunity. I'd like to thank Dr. Agarwal for an excellent talk, and you've always been an inspiration, sir, to all of us. Abhay, who's always been a very encouraging president, and my friends Rajan Relekar and Anirudh Patil. I've been given the topic of intracutaneous fistula. And if you listen to Dr. Agarwal's talk, that is a fistula which is created intentional. Mine is the one which is created inadvertently. So that's the difference between the two. So an intracutaneous fistula is an abnormal communication between any part of the GI tract and skin and lined by epithelium or granulation tissue, as we can see here, either the small bowel or the large bowel. The classification of intracutaneous fistula could be a simple fistula, like a direct communication between the bowel and the parietus. It could be complicated by many tracts, the involvement of more than one viscus, or associated with an abscess cavity. It could be an end fistula where there is no further GI continuity, or it could be a lateral fistula wherein there will be partial defects of the GI tract. The other way of classifying intracutaneous fistulas would be based on the output. So a high output fistula would mean an output of an efflux of more than 500 ml per day, and a low output would mean an efflux of less than 500 ml per day. Primary would be disease in the wall of the gut, like a Crohn's disease, and secondary as a consequence of injury in an otherwise normal gut, surgical resection. Postoperative fistulas, and 75 to 80% of the fistulas occur in this category because of emergency surgery or surgery for malignancy or inflammatory bowel disease. Spontaneous fistulization is seen in diverticular disease, ischemic bowel, and inflammatory bowel disease. The anatomic classification would be the oral, pharyngeal, and esophageal fistulae consequent to head and neck malignancies, post-operative, post-CT-RT. Gastric fistula following splenectomy or bariatric surgery, partial gastrectomy, closure of a perforated gastric ulcer, or consequent to removal of a feeding gastrostomy tube. A duodenal fistula would arise from a Billrod II gastrectomy, a duodenal trauma, an accidental injury during a hemicolectomy, biliary surgery, or a right nephrectomy, peptic ulceration, Crohn's disease, or a breakdown of the duodenal suture line. Nowadays, we don't see the breakdown. We're using more of staplers. And the causes would be inadequate surgical closure, drain too close to the suture line, damage to the blood supply, strangulating sutures, or obstruction distal to the duodenal stump at the site of the gastrojejunostomy in a Billrod II. Small bowel fistulas are the commonest. They arise from the small intestine, and 70 to 90% of the intracutaneous fistulas occur in the postoperative period from disruption of anastomosis or injury to the bowel during dissection or closure of the abdomen. A colonic fistula would result from diverticulitis, malignancy, inflammatory bowel disease, appendicitis and pancreatitis, resection and anastomosis, and a closure of colostomy. The physiological classification is more relevant. Classification of intracutaneous fistulas by the amount of daily output provides information regarding mortality and may predict spontaneous closure. So you'll have a range from a low output fistula draining less than 200 ml per day to a moderate output between 200 to 500 and a high output more than 500 ml per day. And the higher the output, the more the possibility of fluid-electric imbalance and malnutrition. And the mortality would range from 16% in the low output to as high as 54% in the high output, obviously because of a lot of the electrolyte disturbances that occur. The etiology would be inflammatory, Crohn's disease, diverticular disease, peptic ulceration, pancreatitis, neoplastic colonic cancer, ovarian cancer, small bowel malignancy, trauma, abdominal surgery, radiation and penetrating injury, and infection like tuberculosis or actinomycosis. An intracutaneous fistula results from several processes. Trauma to the normal bowel, including inadvertent or missed enterotomies. Anastomotic disruption following surgery for a variety of conditions. Diseased bowel extending to surrounding structures. Extraintestinal disease involving otherwise normal bowel. What then is the magnitude of the problem? Intracutaneous fistulas remain a great challenge and are one of the most dreaded complications following intra-abdominal surgeries. They rank among the most difficult conditions in surgery to manage. 75 to 80% of intracutaneous fistulas are post-operative as a result of iatrogenic bowel injury, inadvertent enterotomy, or anastomotic leak. And the mortality remains high between 10 to 30%. And sepsis, malnutrition, and electrolyte imbalances are the three key factors leading to mortality. What then are the problems? First of all, there's a loss of gastrointestinal contents, and this will lead to hypovolemia, hypoalbuminemia, electrolyte imbalance, malabsorption, vitamin and trace element deficiency. And as you can see, saliva contributes 1500, stomach 2500, etc. On the skin, there'll be eczematous excoriation of the skin around the mouth of the fistula. There'll be sepsis due to an associated abscess cavity or indwelling urinary or intravenous lines. Obviously, this patient is septic and is in the ICU, and there could be a lot of psychological problems as well. How does one assess and manage these patients? The assessment and management is based on the SSS SNAP regime. We have the S for stabilization, sepsis control, skin care, nutrition support, anatomical delineation, and P is planned to deal with the fistula. The assessment and management, as described by Sheldon, is in 4 phases. First is the recognition and stabilization, which should take about 1 to 2 days. Investigation the next 7 to 10 days after stabilization. A decision within 10 days to 6 weeks, and definitive treatment at the end of 6 to 8 weeks. The emphasis being on a multidisciplinary team approach. The recognition and stabilization, an intracutaneous fistula would be suspected when there's delayed return of bowel function, fever, unexplained tachycardia, hypotension, and a drain which is bilious or feculent. The stabilization would be with crystalloids, colloids of blood, maintain a hemoglobin of more than 12 grams per cent and albumin of more than 3.5, electrolyte depletion, and nutritional support. Control of sepsis with appropriate antibiotics and an open or percutaneous drainage of the abscess. Nowadays, we could do pigtail drainages very routinely. A reduction of the fistula output would be with the help of PPI, somatostatin analogs, and octreotide, infliximab. Control of fistula drainage with the help of stoma bags, sump drainage, VAC, upside, and wound manager. And we shall see a lot of these patients as we go along in this talk. When one investigates the origin of the fistula, the investigation will also mean looking at the body weight and the skin fold thickness. This is to assess the degree of malnutrition. To look at the blood parameters, hemoglobin, electrolytes, LFT, serum albumin, blood urea nitrogen. The investigation to define the anatomical characteristics of the fistula would mean a fistulography or barium contrast studies, detection of the abscess cavity with USG or CT scan, and endoscopic studies like an ogiriscopy or colonoscopy, depending on the site of the fistula. The decision would be based on what is the origin of the fistula. Is there discontinuity of the bowel or is there a lateral fistula? Is there a distal obstruction? Is there an associated abscess cavity? What is the condition of the bowel around and distal to the fistula? That is very important. Evaluate the likelihood of spontaneous closure and decide duration of trial of non-operative management. So this is the key in the decision making. And the definitive treatment would be decide the duration of trial of non-operative treatment, manage sepsis free for 4 to 6 weeks, nutritional support, have the anatomical details, look at the clinical improvement and the prognostic details, and definitive surgery when closure is unlikely or when there is sepsis. The point we are trying to make is that it could be either too little too early or too much too late. You've got to be proactive in your approach and not do too much or not do too little, as in when you're continuing the conservative line of treatment. When one talks of the definitive therapy, 80 to 90% will close within 6 weeks with conservative treatment. And these are the lateral fistulas. Definitive operative correction remains the final step in the treatment of non-healing small intestinal fistula. Surgery between 10 days and 6 weeks post-op will encounter the worst adhesion. So basically, we are not talking about any intermediate surgery. It is always delayed surgery. Preferably wait up to 6 to 8 weeks before exploration and repair the defect. In case of fecal fistula due to intense inflammation, it is prudent to wait even longer. Patient should be by then nutritionally optimized and vitally stable. The patient should not be in sepsis. In a majority of cases, preferred surgery is section of the involved segment with primary end-to-end anastomosis. So this is the algorithm of management. If at the end of 6 weeks, the conservative treatment fails, and if the patient is in a good nutritional state, is not septic, is not hypoalbuminic, you can take up for a laparotomy and resect the fistula and do an end-to-end anastomosis. But even at the end of 8 weeks, if the patient is hypovolemic and septic, then the only other option left to you is to exercise the ends of the bowel and then again go back to the whole regimen of treating conservatively. The definitive treatment is a planned operative approach wherein we look at refunctionalization of the entire bowel, resection of the fistula with end-to-end anastomosis, a secure abdominal closure, a feeding jejunostomy, and continued nutritional support until full oral nutrition is achieved. The principles of treatment would be hypoalbuminic and septic patients are prone to anastomotic leaks. So be wary of that. Anastomosis do not heal when they lie in an abscess cavity. Simple abscess heal satisfactorily when aspirated. Complex abscess cavities require surgery. So these are those, the multiloculated abscesses. Extravased bowel, although producing stoma, discharge its contents safely onto the body surface. So it is better to extravase the bowel rather than have an intra-abdominal abscess and complex abscesses. And this, in a nutshell, would be the principles of treatment in a patient with intracutaneous fistula. The treatment of patients with intracutaneous fistula is sort of given in an acronym known as the SOVATS guidelines. The S stands for the sepsis control. The O for optimization of the nutritional status, which would mean rehydration and electrolyte supplementation, a combination of parenteral and enteral nutrition. Wound care, delineating the anatomy of the bowel and the fistula, the timing of surgery, and obviously the surgical strategy. And in the 20th century, mortality rate associated with intracutaneous fistula was as high as 70 to 100%. But as we went along and as we understood the pathophysiology better, a multidisciplinary approach with special emphasis on nutritional support has helped decrease the mortality rate to 15 to 30%. A poor outcome in intracutaneous fistula. What is a poor outcome? A poor outcome is failure of an external small intestinal fistula to close spontaneously. And this would occur because the acronym FRIEND, a foreign body in the tract, radiation enteritis, infection or inflammation at the fistula origin, epithelialization of the tract or end fistula, neoplasm or nutritional depletion, and a distal obstruction, diseased bowel, or a duodenal fistula. The pathogenesis of malnutrition, and malnutrition is one of the key factors in failure of conservative management, is that there's egress of intestinal contents through the fistula. The distal gut is excluded from the absorption process. The loss of macronutrients, fluid and electrolytes, and this leads to malnutrition. Added to that is inadequate food intake and excessive loss of gastrointestinal contents, increased energy expenditure associated with the inflammatory state. These together lead to stress starvation, neuroendocrine and cytokine effects of inflammation, increased metabolic rate, and malnutrition. So it's a vicious cycle, and we have to somehow break the cycle and have a proper nutritional support to break the cycle. The pathogen of malnutrition, as I continue, protein catabolism accelerates to meet the demands for tissue repair and for gluconeogenesis. So the hyperglycemia and glucose intolerance. And that is why it's so important to be monitoring the blood sugar as well. Subsequently, 55 to 90% of patients with intracutaneous fistula become severely malnourished. This leads to a decrease in the healing capacity and increase in the susceptibility to infection. If you can see a low output fistula, the calorie requirements would be 30 to 35 kilocalories per day with a protein requirement of 1 to 2 grams per kg per day. But a high output fistula will have high demands of calories, 45 to 50 kilocalories per kg per day, and a high demand for protein, 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kg per day. The problem here is that although these are, yes, hello. I'm okay. Yeah. Now the thing is that the problem here.
Thank you so much.
The problem here is that you need to.
Thank you, sir.
Although these are the.
It's all your foundation.
Dr. Agarwal will have to mute.
Kuldeep, please mute.
Agarwal, sir, please mute yourself.
Kuldeep, please mute Dr. J.P. Agarwal.
Yeah. So now, although it's nice and easy to say that we require 45 to 50 and we require 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kg per day, in practice, it may not always be possible. That is why our problems arise in intracutaneous fistula, that it takes a longer time to treat these patients. The importance of nutritional support. Desirable to provide energy as a combination of glucose and fat in amount that match the energy expenditure. This composition also gives enough amino acids to support protein synthesis. The mortality rate of 42% with albumin less than 2.5 versus 0% if the albumin is more than 3.5. And 73% of intracutaneous fistulas close spontaneously in adequately nourished patients, as against 19% in malnourished patients. So I think these statistics very clearly state the importance of nutritional support in these patients. What are the type of nutrition that we're going to support, that we're going to give? Enteric nutrition is the preferred form of nutrition in intracutaneous fistulas. unless there's a prominent paretic ileus or the fistula arises from the proximal part of the GI tract. Early initiation of enteral nutrition is crucial in improving outcome. The gut is a therapeutic target, and use the gut when functional. Avoiding feeding is intestinal neglect. So although the fistula output may be there, so long as you can take care of the skin carefully, if you can start the patient on some sort of enteral nutrition, it's going to work well. Parenteral nutrition is indicated in proximal intestinal fistulas, patients with high output intracutaneous fistulas, and when there's severe sepsis and ileus, when the patient just can't take orally. But the best would be a combination of enteral and parenteral. So we are talking about an ENPN synergy. In cases of intolerance to oral feeds, high output fistulas, high fistulas, you have to have a balancing therapy, ENPN synergy, to meet the requirements. As the patient starts tolerating more and more oral fluids, reduction may be made in the amount of PN till the time it is completely stopped. Gradually taper the PN and increase the amount of EN, and finally go on to total enteral nutrition. And that is the way to go about treating these patients. It is also imperative to add immunonutrients and micronutrients to ensure a comprehensive nutritional support, because remember, these patients are losing a lot of fluids. Calcium supplements, since the low serum calcium, are often identified due to hypoalbuminemia. Trace elements like magnesium, phosphorus, zinc, and selenium. Vitamins B complex and C, up to 10 times the normal requirements of vitamin C, should be provided. Use of immune modulating nutrients like glutamine dipeptide and omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, and trials have shown definite clinical benefits. The pharmacological support, and this is something which is coming up in a big way. PPI, especially helpful in proximal fistulas to reduce the fistula output. So we go in for a double dose of PPI. A combination of octreotide and parenteral nutrition seem to have synergistic effect on the reduction of effluent volume with influence in the spontaneous closure rate. And this is an article in the Hepatogastroenterology in 2002, which evaluated the effectiveness of octreotide in the conservative treatment of postoperative intracutaneous fistulas. A word about fibrin glue, and this is something which is sort of, I don't know whether it's practiced routinely, but I thought I'll just put it up as one of the things, that endoscopic treatment of GI fistulas with biological fibrin glue. Endoscopic treatment of fistulas with biological glue has a high success rate in sealing with complications, helping to speed up the healing process and reduce costs, particularly in low output intracutaneous fistulas. So obviously, low output. Now, closure of gastroenteral fistulas using fibrin sealant under fistulography, sedative occlusion under fistulography is effective for gastroenteral fistulas, as seen in the article in surgery, international surgery. Now, the debate is always whether to conserve or re-explore. And I think the first gut feeling should be conserve. Immediate surgical therapy on presentation is contraindicated. Intervention in the presence of sepsis and poor general condition would be hazardous for the patient. Only after these issues have been dealt with adequately and the fistula persists after conservative measures should further surgery be complicated. So I think the message here is go conservative as far as possible. The metabolic and nutritional complications are associated with high morbidity and mortality. Hence, treatment aim should be directed towards achieving anabolism by resolving sepsis and by instituting nutritional support. The second thing would be to reduce the fistula output with PPI and octreotide, and to protect the skin and control the efflux with WAC, a wound manager, which helps significantly. An intensive nutritional, metabolic, and ancillary support creates a favorable basis for spontaneous closure or for successful surgical closure. Conventional therapy in the initial phase is always conservative, and the emphasis should be on a multidisciplinary approach and a proactive approach, in the sense that you have to monitor these patients carefully, and the decision making may change almost every day as to what is the next step. I work in a general hospital, and these are some of the patients, as one would joke, viewer discretion is sort of advised when you look at these patients. These are patients who are referred from other hospitals with challenging intracutaneous fistulas. These are challenging situations from a management point of view, as patients have generally undergone multiple explorations and they are still struggling to do well. What then is the priority of care in these patients? One would have to carefully assess as to what went wrong, and then careful planning would be required. But it is important to understand that don't try to play a hero. Situations that harm call for management that harms less. So, it's important that, respect what was done so far, and then no matter how ghastly this looks, just make sure that you go about it the right way and not take some harsh or drastic decisions and try to intervene as early as possible. The priority of care would be emphasis on stabilization of the hemodynamic status. As I said, restoration of fluid and electrical imbalance, appropriate use of antibiotics to control the sepsis, wound care to drain intra-abdominal source and prevent soiling of the surrounding skin, nutrition and metabolic support to enhance the immunological response, and psychological counseling. And the other thing would be that rule out an abnormal pathology, rule out tuberculosis, rule out malignancy, rule out Crohn's disease, because now you take the patient as a fresh case and try to establish the cause. Is the patient immunocompromised? There is malnourishment, obviously. There could be intra-abdominal sepsis. Is the patient having HIV or is the patient a diabetic? And when you look at all this, you will have to come to an answer as to what went wrong in this patient. And with due respect to the earlier surgery done, 75 to 80% of intracutaneous fistulas are post-operative as a result of iatrogenic bowel injury, inadvertent enterotomy, or anastomotic leak. Presumably, technical factor may not always be the cause, if you respect the earlier surgery, but some of the decisions taken in primary surgery could be debatable. The failure to recognize sepsis early, signs sometimes blunted because patients are often severely malnourished and do not show clear signs of infection. So that is where you probably miss. And sepsis, the most common accompanying problem, is the development of an intracutaneous fistula and the leading cause of death. Therefore, it is imperative to recognize early signs of sepsis. The management would be obviously adequate intravenous colloids to correct the dehydration, the electrolyte imbalance. As I said, blood transfusion to maintain hemoglobin more than 12, appropriate antibiotics, double dose of proton pump inhibitors, Shelcal, Lopromide, stool softeners or bulk forming agents, injection octreotide, parenteral nutrition. Nowadays, we have the all-in-one bags available with immunonutrition like omega-1, dipeptidyl, and micronutrients, and enteral feeding with tolerable amounts of high calories and protein diets, but avoiding hypoosmolar contents. The emphasis is on a conservative management. We have to understand that patients have undergone several operative procedures and their physiological and nutritional reserves are severely compromised. Malnutrition and sepsis identified as two main factors of the problem. Management should focus on aggressive treatment of sepsis and control of the fistula output. And nutritional requirements must be addressed and attention paid to skin care and psychological support. And this is what you can achieve if you're a little patient and if you follow the protocol that we just spoke about, that emphasis on wound care to drain the intra-abdominal source and prevent soiling of the surrounding skin. So this is a patient on admission. This is 4 days after admission, and after 2 weeks of admission, this is what happened. This is the stoma which was created, and the rest of the fistulas seem to have healed. A thing which probably has revolutionized the whole treatment of intracutaneous fistulas is the use of vacuum-assisted closure. It helps to keep the wounds dry, prevents contamination of the stools, and avoids multiple dressing. And that's where your resident is probably the most happy in managing this patient. Gone are the days when Dr. Agarwal would remember, we would be applying aluminum paints and we would be using sponges to keep the patient dry.
Zinc oxide.
Yes. This is what we have achieved. This is another thing that we can do. These are the wound managers. Dr. Agarwal spoke on the stoma therapy and the stoma nurses. These are stoma nurses which help us with the wound managers. And here are ghastly wound with bowel and stoma here. And this is where we've used the wound manager. And this is what we've achieved with the stoma here, which will be closed at a later date. Way back in 2000, when I was with Dr. Mathur, and Ratna would, if she's around, she would know that we came out with our first publication, the self-adhesive drape for the management of leaking abdominal wounds. It was a sort of crude attempt, but now with VAC available and wound manager available, we've come a long way in the management of these intracutaneous fistulas. The secret in all this was to keep the whole thing simple, emphasis on nutritional support, controlling sepsis and fistula, psychological counseling, and a team approach. But obviously the surgeon is the main man in the whole team, and he's got ancillary support from the stoma therapist and the nutritionist, and that is what will help you in giving good outcome in this fistula. My take-home message, and this is very convenient because all of us are sitting at home, and probably Dr. Agarwal is enjoying, it looks like water, but something else.
No,
given
the
complex, yeah.
It is water only.
The take-home message would be, given the complex physiologic and management challenges created by post-operative intracutaneous fistulas, use of sound surgical technique in preventing this catastrophic complication is paramount. So one cannot but re-emphasize the basic tenets of safe surgery, of meticulous surgery, and of checking and rechecking, especially when you've done adducer lysis, especially when you've had a long case, to look for enterotomies, to look for serosal tears, to look for compromised bowel, and that will help us a long way in preventing this complication. Thank you. Thank you very much. Rajan, all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajiv. That was
Anirudh,
a very informative talk.
Right.
And some of the images that you showed, they do appear to have been really complex intracutaneous fistulas. And I should congratulate you that you have managed them really well.
Right.
Because to manage them is really a task.
Yes. Yes. Probably that's the reason why Rajesh gave me this topic. He is not my friend.
No, nobody would have done justice to such topics than you and Dr. Agarwal.
Very lucid presentation.
Right. Thanks,
Rajiv, we have to be friends with the delegates. That's why we chose you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No problem. No problem. I'm happy to be with Dr. Agarwal.
Rajiv.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Only one comment here.
Tell me, sir.
See, we do bariatric surgery quite a bit.
Right.
And in our experience, we have come across a fistula which occurs between the esophagus and the stomach there at that point, CO junction.
Right.
And nowadays, most of these are managed by a stent, long stent, which is placed. So that is one of the ways of treating the fistula and closing it early. And second is applying clips, endoscopic. Now over the scope, many clips are available. And even colonic fistulas, they are now applying those over the scope clips, which really doses it from inside, and it will help you in a great extent. This is just for the information of the delegates who are attending, because these are the newer methods of controlling the fistula and closing it faster.
I think Niranjan would tell us about some fistula plugs that they use in perineal fistula, but maybe,
Glue does not help.
They have not helped in the anal fistula also.
Right.
Glues don't help.
Correct.
Regarding the fistula, this thing,
only help the
stents
company.
can probably be used in only upper.
Which one?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Niranjan was saying something.
I said the fistula plug for the perianal fistula only help the companies.
Right. Agreed. We need a lot of support for managing these patients, actually.
Any questions in the chat box?
I can't see.
So,
no, I don't see any questions in the chat box. I would just like to make a point that, like I was just discussing this afternoon with Dr. Yadav, we have a patient right now with us with a perforated duodenal ulcer. He was operated elsewhere 2 weeks back, and now he has developed intracutaneous fistula. We have already passed the NJ tube. He is not in sepsis. We are feeding him enterally completely. Would you like to add something, sir?
No,
the skin side is all healthy and everything.
Yeah, I think it's pretty well laid down. You put a nasojejunal tube, so you're bypassing the opening and you're continuing with the enteral nutrition. I would also suggest that add parenteral nutrition to it, because that it may not be enough. Step up your proton pump inhibitors to double dose. Add octreotide, and most importantly, take care of the skin, because I think this would, if you go aggressively with this for about 4 weeks, it should give you some amount of control. The
amount is hardly 200 ml per day.
Sir, wound manager or VAC. Now, if it's a leaking wound, then it's better to put a VAC. But if it's a sort of controlled wound, then better to put a wound manager, because then sometimes the vacuum keeps the fistula open. So we got to put the VAC at half the pressure. Gradually, you got to keep on reducing the pressure.
Yes.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Yeah. The role of octreotide is mainly in the upper GI fistula, or it is you use it for one?
Yeah. See, basically, I agree that it's more in the upper GI fistula, but we started using this a long time when we started using it for Whipple's in pancreatic fistula. Debatable whether it really works or no. But sometimes as far as intracutaneous fistula goes, whatever works, try and make it work. That's all.
I doubt whether they are useful. They're mainly used in pancreatic fistula.
I agree.
Either perioperatively or postoperatively.
I agree. But there are some studies to say, and we do use it routinely for at least about 7 to 14 days.
So Rajiv, what would be the cutoff point where you would like to, wait for this fistula to heal on its own? The time which you would wait, or where you would like to intervene?
If you remember, Dr. Agarwal spoke about closure of stoma at 8 weeks. Interpolate that and look at 8 weeks your time to control the sepsis and build up the patient. Yes. If you can do that, then it's better. If you can't, maybe you go on a little longer as well. The thing is that if it's a lateral fistula, at least it'll get controlled, may not close. But if it's an end fistula, which is causing sepsis and intra-abdominal abscesses, then I think you'll have to go down and extravase it, because you have to take care of the sepsis.
What about the timing of the VAC? Do you put the VAC on the day when you find a fistula, or?
Yeah. It's a good point you make, because we start off on day 1, because that's where we target if you see some of our pictures, we target the skin first, So if you apply the VAC early, the surrounding skin is taken care of. The problem with VAC is it will keep the fistula open. So you have to reduce you'll have to reduce the pressures in the VAC. And as sir said, eventually you'll have to apply a wound manager.
Okay. Rajiv, I would like to warn, that if you apply too much of pressure on the VAC, you can cause, the suction around the stoma, and the things will, so you have to apply practically half the pressure. It's very, very important.
It's a dynamic process. You'll have to.
Would that not make a low output fistula into a high output fistula?
Good point, but the point is at least it be a controlled fistula. Do you want a controlled high output fistula, or do you want a low output uncontrolled fistula?
Controlled high output.
Yeah. So that's it. And then eventually, once you apply a wound manager, don't think that it's going to be over in 1 week or 2 weeks. Be prepared for about a 3-month period, 8 to 12 weeks. So a controlled fistula is better than uncontrolled fistula. A low output is better than a high output. Now you'll have to balance your therapy and treatment accordingly to reach a stage where you think that you'll be only applying a wound manager. Start the patient on orals. Even if the fistula output is high, but he's taking enough adequately, it is a good sign. So it's a dynamic process.
Sorry. Rajiv, you mean to say that if somebody has a leak through the intra-abdominal wound, whether it is midline or a coccus, so would you like to go ahead from a day 1 and put a VAC on it, or you like to really wait?
Yeah, the thing is, if you see the crude version is the opsite, because that will give very low pressure, but it will keep the wound dry. It will keep the patient dry. The other option is to put a low pressure VAC. And the third is that if you have a good stomal therapist and it's going to stick properly, the best is to put a wound manager.
But wound manager makes it very expensive, let me tell you.
It keeps on coming out.
Very expensive.
It keeps on coming out.
Comparatively, the VAC is cheaper.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So basically what we do is we go for low pressure.
See, the ultimate aim for when we do this wound manager or VAC or anything is not that it is a primary treatment for fistula.
Not at all.
Just for the
It's for control
and around things.
Control. It is for control.
Just to make it more controlled.
What's going to kill the patient is the sepsis. So if you have these intra-abdominal collections and if you put a VAC, some of it come out of the side of the fistula, and at least the abdomen is kept better.
Dr. Rajiv.
Yeah.
Dr. Abhay Dalvi has something to say.
Go ahead.
Dr. Dalvi, you can go ahead, sir.
My question, through 36 years of experience as staff at GS Medical College, and one thing which I could not solve years along through my retirement is superior mesenteric artery thrombosis and gangrene. We bring out possibly the first 6 inches of jejunum as a stoma, and then the transverse colon as a colonic fistula. All the things that you have said, what according to you is the ideal time to go in and anastomose? That's the issue. Exactly. So the patient actually just deteriorates in front of you and dies. That is the end point. So my two questions is, I have one patient in that who survived for 6 months and after anastomosis, and the gastroenterologists were busy trying to find out where the capsule was which they had put into the patient just to record the images. So that's the only patient in my this. So how do you go about counseling the patient or the relative that you're going to die?
Yeah, so the thing is that one of the things that you can do is change from 36 years to the newer generation of small bowel transplant. You know, so
I was going to say the same thing. Small bowel transplant is the answer.
Small bowel
transplant. Let me come in here. If at all Rajiv wants to say that, let me tell him that there are enough number of people who have got into small bowel transplant, and there is only one surgeon throughout India who has told us about success of small bowel transplant. Let Rajiv tell us who is this person.
Yeah, so, I have 2 or 3 people actually who can talk about a small bowel transplant. But
there is one person in Chennai and there is one person in Mumbai who has done small bowel transplant successfully.
Yeah, but
I don't want to get into it. Let's not get into it. I'm just trying to tell you that it's an extremely difficult problem as far as enterocutaneous fistulas is concerned. High bowel fistulas are extremely difficult to manage. Whatever you do, they just go down the hill in front of your eyes, especially in public hospitals. Whatever you do, even in private hospitals where a lot of money is spent, but it's extremely difficult. Distal stomas are the things that can be managed successfully. I will congratulate both of you all, sir. Sir is my sir, so I cannot congratulate him. But Rajiv, let me call excellent lecture, absolutely to the point, and congratulate you from my heart.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhay.
So, I think Dr. Abhay has left. So, sir, is there, when we find a superior mesenteric artery gangrene where the bowel is involving right from the DJ up to the proximal colon, is it really point to operate or counsel at that particular point to the relative and tell them we cannot offer him much and just leave him?
See, the thing is, it's difficult to open and close. Once you open, you got to resect the gangrenous bowel, you know. But the only thing is that you got to explain to the patient that, look, the prognosis is very poor. The other thing that happens is the patient survives. You can put the patient on a home parenteral nutrition, gain time, and then maybe go in for a small bowel transplant. Of course, it's very difficult, as Abhay said, that probably very few centers in India who do it. But the point is that the only solution to that is a small bowel transplant. Whatever we're doing, whether we give home parenteral nutrition, whether we manage these patients, I think most of them succumb at the end of 6 months because of tuberculosis and massive electrolyte imbalance.
Second point here,
I would like to ask, sir.
I agree with Rajiv. No, I think I agree with Rajiv. Small bowel transplantation is not something which is it is a solution, but not in India as of today. The results are very poor, but it is being done in USA, where patients can live on with parenteral nutrition through IJV, etc., for a very long time, waiting for a good intestine transplant. So it's the future, and let's see how it goes about.
Correct. We have to offer the patient. This is the possibility.
Actually, from KM, I offered one patient. The patient was referred to Jupiter. They did a transplant. It succeeded for about 2 months, and then the patient died. But that's okay. At least 2 months the patient lived. I was talking about the other patient who we had done a duodenocolic anastomosis, which surprisingly stenosed. The patient name was Seema. I remember it. And the gastroenterology people wanted to trace that capsule which they had introduced, and it was stuck at the anastomotic site. And every day the gastroenterology people used to come and look at the stools, whether I can retrieve the capsule. So that's the story that I just wanted to get into, because this is the patient who survived for 6 months with absolute no problems, possibly I was very young at that time. She died of nutritional and, all those magnesium, zinc related complications. But one thing I had learned at that time, that duodenocolic anastomosis patient can live for a period of 6 months. And that is how I think the transplantation of small intestine come into picture. So just to say intracutaneous fistula is extremely difficult to manage. It depends on the site of the fistula. That more distal it is easier to manage. Proximal, it becomes difficult. And I think the surgeon and the team, I think Rajiv has talked of a team. That team is extremely important to see survival, oblique, quality of life at a later date. When to go in is a big question mark. Sometimes when you know that patient is going to go downhill in spite of your efforts, you have to go in and try and do anastomosis, otherwise the patient is dead. Thank you.
Rajiv, there is one question in the chat box.
Yeah, go ahead.
Endoscopic VAC therapy has any role in any fistula?
No,
I'm not getting the question.
I'm not getting the question, but basically VAC is VAC.
No, I've not heard about endoscopic VAC as such.
No, not as such. Not really.
You can unmute Rashmi and you can ask if she has heard about it.
I cannot. Somebody has to unmute.
Kuldeep can unmute Rashmi and she can elaborate if she knows about endoscopic VAC. Kuldeep?
Kuldeep so gaya.
Kuldeep has gone home and probably enjoying.
If we are not able to do that, then we can call it a day.
Yeah.
Niranjan,
Sir, I'm trying to do that.
Okay. So you are awake now.
Yes.
Okay. She says that she had heard about Dr. Kopikar of it in a lecture. It's a vague question, actually.
Niranjan, with your permission, can I come in?
Yes, sir.
We need your permission. You don't need our
permission. No. It's not like that. Again, I want to go on record. Sir, Dr. J.B. Agarwal has been my teacher as far as laparoscopic surgery is concerned, and an excellent lecturer on stoma. Rajiv is my colleague. He has been promoted to emeritus professor. Congratulations to you, Rajiv. Another excellent lecture that you have taken. And may God prevail, and somewhere down the line, if I can help you in getting ahead, my blessings to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. It's been an excellent session. Though there were less number of...
Rashmi Mehta has joined. If he wants to say something, I think she can be allowed to talk. Rashmi?
Rashmi there.
Rashmi, you'll have to...
She's unmuted. She's unmuted now.
Rashmi, want to speak? Speak. Rashmi, actually, this person, I think, was my first registrar after I got the unit. But she's not speaking, so we can wind up. Okay.
So,
hello.
Right?
Yeah, Niranjan, go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. And it was an excellent session with a lot of information and take-home messages. Though the number of people joined were less, but I'm sure those who have joined, or rather I would say those who have not joined, missed a lot today. And those who have joined have been enlightened on a lot of new things and a lot of refreshing so many things. Thank you both the speakers, and thank you both the chairperson for spearheading. And thank you, Dr. Dalvi sir, for always being around and encouraging us. Thank you, Juventus, for yet another session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Very good.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Good night, sir. Shall we leave the meeting?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you.